Wrangel Island sits in the Arctic Ocean, between the Chukchi Sea and the East Siberian Sea. For most of the year, it is surrounded by shifting ice. The land itself remains still, but everything around it moves: pack ice drifting, pressure ridges forming, and leads opening and closing without pattern. There are no permanent settlements, no infrastructure, only a narrow strip of tundra, low hills, and a coastline shaped by wind and ice over thousands of years. In late summer, the island becomes briefly accessible. The sea ice loosens, allowing ships to approach its shores. The snow recedes in patches, exposing damp ground and scattered vegetation. Mosses and lichens dominate. Small animals move quietly across the terrain. Birds arrive in short-lived cycles, using the island as a place to rest or breed before leaving again. By early autumn, the light begins to change. The days shorten. The horizon flattens under a uniform sky. Temperatures fall steadily, and the ice begins to return. What was once open water closes again, sealing the island off from the rest of the world. There is no gradual transition. Access disappears quickly. For those who remain on Wrangel Island after this point, departure is no longer a matter of choice. The environment does not react. It does not recognize presence or absence. It remains constant in its conditions, regardless of who is there or who is left behind. Ada Blackjack was born in 1,898 inches, a small Inuit settlement in Alaska. Her early life followed a pattern common to many in the region at the time: seasonal movement, subsistence living, and reliance on community. However, her circumstances changed early. She was sent to a Presbyterian mission school in Nome, where she learned English and basic domestic skills. Traditional survival knowledge, such as hunting or trapping, was not emphasized in her upbringing. By her early 20s, Ada's situation had become unstable. Her marriage had ended, and she was left to care for her young son, who suffered from tuberculosis. Medical care required money. Consistent income was difficult to secure. Employment options were limited, especially for a woman without specialized skills beyond sewing and housekeeping. In 1921, an opportunity appeared through an Arctic expedition organized by Vilhjalmur Stefansson. The goal of the expedition was to establish a claim on Wrangel Island. It was presented as a scientific and exploratory effort, though it also carried political motivations. Several young men were selected for the journey. They required additional support: someone to cook, mend clothing, and maintain basic domestic order within the camp. Ada was not recruited as an explorer. She was hired as a seamstress. The offer included wages and the promise of eventual return. For Ada, the decision was practical. She needed money for her son's treatment. There is no record suggesting she had prior experience with Arctic expeditions or extended isolation. She expressed hesitation but ultimately agreed to join. Before departure, she gathered minimal personal belongings. Supplies were organized by the expedition leaders. Weapons, food stores, and equipment were loaded with the assumption that resupply or extraction would occur within a planned time frame. Ada boarded the ship with the others in September 1921. At that point, the journey still had structure. There was a defined goal, a group dynamic, and an expectation of return. The conditions that would later define her experience had not yet emerged. In September 1921, 5 individuals were transported to Wrangel Island by a small vessel navigating through late-season Arctic waters. The group consisted of 4 young men: Alan Crawford, Frederick Maurer, Milton Gall, and Lorne Knight, and Ada Blackjack. None of the men were older than their mid-20s. Their leader, Crawford, had limited Arctic experience. The others brought varying degrees of academic or practical knowledge, but none had previously led an expedition of this scale. They arrived as the brief Arctic summer was ending. Supplies were unloaded quickly. Crates of food, ammunition, and equipment were brought ashore and organized near a chosen campsite. A tent was erected first, followed by the construction of a more stable wooden shelter using pre-cut materials. The process was methodical. Tasks were assigned. Roles began to form. Ada's responsibilities remained consistent with her role. She prepared meals, repaired clothing, and managed small domestic tasks within the shelter. The men focused on hunting, mapping, and maintaining equipment. At this stage, the division of labor appeared functional. The surrounding environment did not immediately present difficulty. Game was available in limited quantities. Seals could be hunted along the ice edges. Occasional polar bears passed through the area. The group supplemented their stored provisions with what they could gather or hunt. Fuel was conserved carefully. Weather conditions, while cold, remained within expected limits for the region. The sea ice had not yet fully returned. There was still a sense of seasonal transition, rather than complete isolation. Communication with the outside world was already minimal. There was no radio. The expedition depended entirely on scheduled resupply or retrieval, expected the following year. This assumption shaped their planning. Rations were calculated based on that timeline. As autumn progressed, the light diminished steadily. The sun remained lower in the sky for shorter periods each day. Temperatures dropped further. The sea began to freeze again, closing access routes. Movement beyond the island became increasingly difficult. Inside the camp, routines settled into repetition. Cooking, maintenance, observation, and hunting formed the structure of each day. The group recorded notes and monitored their supplies. There was no immediate sign of failure. However, the margin for error was narrow. The expedition had been planned with confidence, but not with redundancy. There were no backup teams, no secondary supply routes, no immediate method of evacuation if conditions changed unexpectedly. By early winter, Wrangel Island was once again fully enclosed by ice. At that point, the expedition had transitioned from a temporary presence to a fixed isolation. By early 1923, the expedition had extended far beyond its original expectations. The resupply ship that had been anticipated the previous year never arrived. Ice conditions in the surrounding seas had prevented access. The group had already endured one full Arctic winter, followed by a summer that brought no relief. Food supplies had declined steadily. Hunting had become less reliable. Weather patterns remained unpredictable, and movement across the island was limited by both terrain and temperature. The structure that had defined their routine began to weaken under these constraints. Among the group, Lorne Knight's condition had deteriorated. He showed clear signs of scurvy, fatigue, swelling, and reduced mobility. His ability to contribute to daily tasks diminished. The remaining men carried additional responsibility, but the imbalance was becoming unsustainable. A decision was made. In January 1923, Alan Crawford, Frederick Maurer, and Milton Gale prepared to leave the island. Their plan was to travel across the frozen Arctic Ocean toward Siberia, a journey of several hundred kilometers over unstable ice. The objective was to reach help and organize a rescue. The risks were understood. Ice movement was unpredictable. Temperatures were extreme. Navigation relied on limited tools and visibility. Despite this, staying on the island without external support was no longer considered viable. They gathered essential supplies, food, a sled, basic equipment, and departed on foot. Ada Blackjack remained behind. She was left with Lorne Knight, whose condition continued to decline. Ada had no formal training in medical care. Her experience with hunting and survival remained minimal. The division of roles that had existed at the beginning of the expedition no longer applied. Once the three men disappeared across the ice, there was no further contact. Their departure marked a clear transition. From that point forward, the possibility of immediate assistance was gone. The group on Wrangel Island had been reduced to 2 individuals, one of whom was no longer capable of sustaining himself. The isolation was no longer shared equally. It had narrowed, and it had deepened. After the departure of Crawford, Maurer, and Gale, the structure of the camp changed immediately. The remaining responsibilities, hunting, maintaining shelter, managing fuel, preparing food, no longer had a shared distribution. They settled onto Ada Blackjack. Lorne Knight remained inside the shelter. His condition continued to decline in the weeks that followed. Scurvy had progressed to the point where movement was limited. His joints were swollen. He could no longer walk outside. Tasks that required even minimal physical effort were no longer possible for him. Ada had not been trained to manage illness of this kind. She had no medical supplies beyond what had been left with the expedition. There were no effective treatments available in the camp for scurvy at that stage. Fresh meat could have slowed its progression, but obtaining it required consistent hunting, which Ada was still learning. Her daily routine expanded under pressure. Each day began with maintaining the shelter. Fuel had to be managed carefully. The stove required attention to prevent freezing inside the structure. She collected driftwood when it was available, though supplies were limited. Snow was melted for water. Food stores were checked and rationed. Hunting became necessary, not optional. At first, Ada struggled with the rifle. She had limited experience using firearms. Early attempts were inconsistent. Ammunition was not abundant, which added pressure to each shot. Over time, she adjusted. She began to move more cautiously across the terrain, watching for tracks, learning where animals were more likely to appear. Small game became her primary target. Foxes were trapped when possible. Occasional birds provided additional food. Larger animals, such as seals or polar bears, were more difficult to approach and carried greater risk. Inside the shelter, Knight's condition required constant attention. Ada prepared what food she could and brought it to him. She assisted with basic needs, adjusting bedding, maintaining warmth, and cleaning the space as best she could under the circumstances. There are records indicating that Knight kept a journal during this period. His entries describe the progression of his illness and the increasing dependence on Ada. The documentation provides one of the few detailed accounts of daily life in the camp at that time. As the weeks passed, Knight became weaker. His ability to communicate declined. Periods of silence grew longer. His physical state limited any recovery. Ada continued to maintain the routine. She moved between the interior of the shelter and the outside environment, managing both spaces without assistance. Each task depended on the completion of the previous one. There was no margin for delay. If fuel was not gathered, the shelter cooled. If food was not secured, both individuals weakened further. Weather conditions remained severe. Wind patterns shifted frequently. Visibility was often reduced. Temperatures stayed well below freezing. Despite this, the routine held. There is no record of interruption during this period. No indication that she abandoned tasks or altered the structure significantly. The work continued in a steady sequence, shaped by necessity rather than choice. Knight's condition reached its final stage in June 1923. He died inside the shelter. Ada Blackjack was no longer caring for another person. From that point forward, she was alone on Wrangell Island. After Lorne Knight's death, Ada Blackjack faced a stark reality. She was entirely alone on Wrangell Island. Survival required not only physical endurance but also learning skills she had never practiced. The tools at her disposal were limited, and no instruction had been provided. She relied on observation, trial and error, and previous minimal exposure to domestic work to maintain order in the camp. Her immediate concern was securing food. The expedition had left behind some preserved stores, but these were finite and diminishing. Ada needed fresh meat to survive the months ahead. She began by attempting to hunt small animals using traps and snares. Her first efforts were inconsistent. Foxes, birds, and occasional Arctic hares provided sporadic success. She gradually adjusted her placement of traps and refined her technique, noting patterns in tracks and movement. Fire and shelter maintenance became central to her routine. The wooden shelter, though sturdy, required constant attention. Drifting snow blocked entrances. Fuel supplies, primarily driftwood, and pieces of the surrounding tundra needed careful rationing. Melting snow for drinking water was a daily task, as was ensuring the interior remained warm enough to prevent frostbite and maintain basic hygiene. Ada also had to learn to manage risks from wildlife. Polar bears occasionally approached the camp. She kept a rifle ready, understanding its limitations and the danger of confrontation. She avoided unnecessary travel during poor visibility or storms, balancing the need for resources with personal safety. The psychological dimension of survival was equally significant. She maintained routines to structure her days and preserve mental focus. Repetition of tasks, feeding the stove, checking traps, repairing shelter, provided measurable progress and a sense of control. She avoided dwelling on her isolation or the absence of the 3 men who had left. Her skill in sewing and repair became unexpectedly crucial. Torn clothing could not be replaced, and the harsh Arctic conditions meant minor failures could quickly escalate to serious threats to health. Every patch and stitch became a defensive measure against the environment. By combining observation, discipline, and adaptability, Ada created a system that allowed her to endure. She kept careful watch over the supply of ammunition and ensured that traps were reset daily. She learned to anticipate seasonal changes, using daylight and weather patterns to plan movements. This period of learning without instruction was the foundation of her continued survival. By the time the 2-6-day period of total isolation arrived, Ada had transformed her limited experience into practical competence. She was not prepared in the traditional sense, but necessity had forced her to adapt to an environment that offered no margin for error. The 26 days that followed Lorne Knight's death were marked by strict routine. Ada Blackjack moved through each day with tasks dictated entirely by survival rather than choice. She woke at the first light, or before, depending on visibility, and assessed the shelter and supplies. The stove was checked, ashes cleared, and snow melted for water. Fuel was added to maintain warmth throughout the long, cold hours. Hunting occupied much of the day. She walked the tundra cautiously, observing tracks in the snow and ice. Small game foxes, hares, and occasional birds was prioritized. Traps were inspected, repaired, and reset. Each successful hunt provided both sustenance and reassurance, a signal that the system she had developed continued to function. Food preparation was simple but essential. Raw meat was sometimes eaten if preservation became a concern, though she preferred cooking when fuel allowed. Every scrap was accounted for. Waste could mean weakness or illness. She rationed the remaining expedition supplies, using them to supplement what she hunted. Shelter maintenance remained constant. Snowdrifts built up quickly against the structure. Ice formed along edges of the tent and wooden walls. Ada reinforced weak points and ensured entrances remained accessible. Clothing was repaired as needed, and layering was adjusted based on temperature and wind. The environment dictated movement. During storms, she stayed within the shelter, conserving energy and avoiding exposure. When weather permitted, she gathered wood or checked traps. Every activity had a measured rhythm, a balance between necessity and safety. Isolation also influenced perception of time. Days blurred, marked only by light and practical tasks. There was no external communication, no sound beyond wind, ice, or distant birds. Yet she remained disciplined, understanding that structure was the difference between endurance and decline. Ada managed psychological strain by maintaining this system. The predictability of routine created a framework that countered fear or panic. She focused on immediate tangible objectives: fire, water, food, shelter. Anxiety over rescue or the absence of others was set aside in favor of these concrete tasks. During these 26 days, the Arctic imposed itself fully. Temperatures remained well below freezing, and sudden weather shifts were constant threats. Even so, Ada did not attempt dangerous travel outside her known area. She relied on her established knowledge of the landscape and her prior observations of animal behavior. By the conclusion of this period, she had survived entirely alone, dependent on her own acquired skills and judgment. There were no external interventions, no aid from those who had left. The daily routine, followed without deviation, had enabled her continued existence in an environment that allowed no margin for error. As the isolation extended beyond the 2-6-day mark, Ada's physical state began to show the strain of prolonged survival in the Arctic. Her body was under constant pressure. Exposure to cold, limited nutrition, and the repetitive labor of maintaining the shelter and securing food. Muscle fatigue and joint stiffness became persistent. Minor injuries from handling traps or collecting firewood could not be treated fully and lingered. The psychological weight of solitude was subtle but persistent. Time no longer passed in days or weeks, but in cycles of light and darkness, punctuated only by the routines she had established. The horizon remained flat, and the silence of the tundra was unbroken except for wind, ice, and the occasional distant bird. There was no feedback, no human interaction, no confirmation that the larger world still existed beyond the ice. Weather became increasingly unpredictable. Sudden storms could last hours, covering tracks, burying fuel, and forcing her to remain inside the shelter. Visibility could drop to near zero, making any movement outside dangerous. Yet, survival required venturing beyond the immediate perimeter of her shelter to check traps or collect resources. Each decision involved calculated risk. Physical decline also stemmed from the limited variety in her diet. Small game provided protein, but lacked certain nutrients, and fresh vegetables were non-existent. Over time, minor deficiencies likely compounded. Strength waned. Appetite fluctuated. Every task required greater effort. Yet each completed task was necessary to maintain the delicate balance of existence. Time distorted further. Days, weeks, and months merged. Her perception of duration shifted as survival became purely procedural. Tasks were performed mechanically. Melt snow, check traps, repair clothing, feed the stove. Each cycle measured success in continuity rather than achievement. There were moments of quiet observation, tracking animal movement, noting changes in ice formation, watching cloud patterns, but these were functional rather than recreational. They served practical purposes, predicting resource availability or planning safe movement. In this period, Ada's endurance was tested continuously. No dramatic events occurred, yet the accumulation of strain, isolation, and environmental pressure created a constant, unrelenting challenge. Survival was measured not in milestones, but in persistence, the ability to continue despite silence, cold, and uncertainty. In August 1923, nearly 2 years after the original expedition arrived on Wrangel Island, a relief ship finally reached the Arctic coast. The vessel approached the island cautiously, navigating through patches of late summer ice. Crews observed the landscape from a distance, noting signs of habitation, the small shelter, footprints, and the remnants of makeshift structures. Ada Blackjack was discovered inside the shelter. She was alive, though thin and physically weakened. Her clothing was patched repeatedly, her hands roughened from handling tools and firewood. The condition of the camp reflected months of meticulous maintenance, traps in place, firewood organized, and the shelter intact despite harsh weather. The men who had left in January 1923 never returned. Lorne Knight had died within weeks of their departure. The other expedition members were later found in various states along the ice route they had attempted, but none had survived the journey. Ada's survival was exceptional, not because of luck alone, but because of the routines, discipline, and adaptation she had maintained over an extended period. Rescue crews did not dramatize the scene. There was no celebration, no external fanfare. Ada was assisted onto the ship and provided with basic medical attention. Records indicate she required time to regain strength, but she was conscious and capable of recounting the conditions she had endured. The relief marked the end of her immediate danger. Wrangel Island returned to its previous quiet state. Ice and tundra once again enclosed the area, leaving the landscape largely unchanged by human presence. Ada Blackjack's experience on Wrangel Island became a documented example of endurance in extreme isolation. Her survival demonstrated the practical effectiveness of routine, observation, and disciplined adaptation in an environment that allowed no margin for error. She returned to Alaska quietly, without public acclaim, and resumed life with her son. Historically, her story illustrates the consequences of underprepared expeditions in the Arctic. The deaths of the other members and the hardships she endured underscore the risks inherent in traveling without redundancy, medical preparation, or reliable resupply. It also provides a clear record of individual survival in extreme conditions, unassisted by external intervention. Records from the expedition, including journals, photographs, and official reports, remain the primary source of understanding her time on the island. These documents emphasize procedural survival, food management, shelter maintenance, and the mental discipline required to maintain focus over extended periods. There is no evidence of embellishment or dramatization. Her achievements were rooted in methodical, consistent action. The landscape she endured remains largely unchanged. Wrangel Island continues to exist as an isolated, sparsely inhabited Arctic outpost. Seasonal ice patterns return predictably, wildlife continues its cycles, and the environment retains its indifference to human presence. In reflecting on Ada Blackjack's experience, the significance lies not in heroism or spectacle, but in quiet resilience. Survival depended on adaptation, patience, and attention to detail. The record she left is a testament to human endurance and the limits of preparation in one of the harshest regions on Earth. The Arctic returned to silence. Only footprints, the remnants of a small shelter, and the faint traces of human activity remained evidence of a survival measured in days, discipline, and persistence.